In this video, why you can grow a bonsai from seed in a pot. You cannot grow bonsai from seed. Why growing slow might be better than growing fast. You can't fatten up a trunk in a small pot. Why sometimes it is better to grow a bonsai in a pot than in the soil. You need to take a massive container. Really? If you start from seed, you're going to be dead before you have a nice tree. I disagree with all of them. As long as you manage your expectations, you can very well grow a bonsai from seed in a pot in a reasonable amount of time. Right, I know. I can already see my comment section explode. And absolutely you are 100% right. Growing a trunk out in full ground is going to be a lot quicker process than doing it in a big pot or even in a small pot. Alright, now that we have established that this is not the fastest way to get a big fat trunk on this tree, why do I do it? Let's take a dive in and follow me around. I'm going to show you a number of pots, a number of plants. I'm going to do a little bit of a tour of my garden and show you on different plants what I mean and why. This is Jelle, growing bonsai, and we are going to look at seedlings, cuttings and growing bonsai from them. Why do I grow out things in a pot? Mind you, I do have a growing field. I have trees in the ground here as well, so I do both. One does not per se exclude the other. Things that you have better control over when you're growing in a pot. It's the internet length, it's the bark, it's the cut size, and it's the nabari. Those things are important components for quality bonsai. It's not only about size, it is also about quality. And that is why I also grow in the pot. I think some of these things you can control much. Some of these things I think you can control much better when they're in a pot than when they're in full ground. Now let's take a look at bark. This is an Ulmus pumila. I think I'll need to check. I will pop the link right in there. And this one and that one and the third tree that I'm going to look at later on are all cuttings from this tree. So this is what the bark looks like on one of these young cuttings. This is about 1 year old and you see there's a few corky bits on there, but it's not really cracking open yet. Now this is 3-4 years from a cutting. You can see here also the bark starting to crack in very nice small fissures with lots and lots of cracks on this narrow trunk. This I'm growing really slow. This has been a decade in this pot. And I don't want any branches to grow thicker than about ½ an inch, a centimeter. So this branch is on the nomination to be removed. It has done its job. The base is nice and white. The nabari is really starting to form. I haven't cleaned up the base this year and I really need to get rid of the moss because the bark is really starting to crack nicely. Has a very good structure. So you can see here the roots really spreading nicely. This is all still nabari, but it is covered in this moss, which is really not good. But the bark here, you can see it is nice and cracked and flaky, very finely fissured. What the benefits are to grow out in a pot over growing out in a field. That's what this is about, not about what is the quickest way to grow a trunk. Because the quickest way, put it in the ground, forget about it for 5 years, and then you have a nice stovepipe, you make a solid cut across the top, you let that grow out again, and after 6-7 years you have the start of a tree. Now this is the first side branch of this plant, and that's only 4 years in the ground. The lower trunk is really difficult to see because there's so much growth here. But look at that. Look at how big that is. But also look at how coarse and swollen these bark ridges are. That's not going to be more refined. But this is pretty much 4 years of growth. And that's very similar to what you see here on this trident maple. This is growing in the ground. It is fattening up nicely, but you see that you get very big cut marks where I've had to remove quite large branches. So yes, it grows a lot quicker, but you do get much bigger scars unless you really prune back every other week. But that defeats the purpose of ground growing, right? These are 5 Malus crabapple seedlings that I grew from seed. I collected the seeds 2 years ago. I planted them. Last year in spring they germinated and they grew for the season. This year I pruned 3 of them and I let 1 of them just go. And all of this in this little pot. They were planted in this pot, they germinated in this pot, and they grew in this pot, and I've never done any root work on them. That is a failure on my side. I should have done root work to get a better nabari. I did wire out the young trunks last year, but you can see these have grown extensively. So what size of a pot do you need? Well, obviously you take the biggest pot that you can get, and you take your cutting and you plant it in there. Then it is just like you are growing in the ground. That's an argument often heard, and it is wrong. Why is it wrong? Well, to understand that, we have to go into physics. I don't know about you, but I am not very good at physics. I forgot more of it than that I can remember. But we all know what happens if you have a big pot and you water it. The water stays in the pot. Some of it drains out, but if you lift the pot after watering and you tilt it a little bit, more water starts sipping out. Let's see whether this actually does what I say it will do. There you go. So this was all water that was in the pot, but stayed in the pot and didn't really drain. Now that's really great, because that means that the roots have access to water, but it also means that the roots are sitting in water. They don't get oxygen. Now in a big pot you have the same thing. Smaller pots have a bigger problem than the bigger pots, but the lowest part of the pot will have water standing there. Now if you have a plant with the root ball that completely covers the whole pot, that's not an issue, because the roots will suck up that water, and after a couple of hours it will have drained all the water. But if not, then the roots will have a very, very hard time growing, because it will stay too wet, too cold, and there's very little oxygen. So yes, a pot can be too big to grow out your bonsai. This is also why professional tree growers don't put their seedlings or their cuttings in a big pot straight away. They put them in a small pot, and once or twice a year they take them out of the pot and they put them in a slightly bigger container to continue the growing on. That's actually faster than putting it in a very big container. Now why doesn't that work in the soil that way? I can't explain. It is about cohesive forces, where in the substrate the water is retained and it doesn't sink away, and in a pot that works that way. But in normal soil it doesn't. It keeps on sinking down and you don't get water standing, except for when it rains for a long time and you get puddles. But in a normal soil you have better drainage than in a pot. And that is basically the core reason why just growing it out in as big a pot as possible is actually a bad idea. You are better off growing your young plants in a pot slightly oversized. Now this is a tree that is growing in a slightly oversized pot. And you might say, well, the pot actually looks quite small for the tree. That's correct, but that's because it grew so much this year. Because all the growth that is bigger than this is from this year. Yes, even an extension like this has all grown in 1 year. In a pot. So don't you go telling me that you can't grow a tree in a small pot, because it will not grow out. It does grow out quite well. The benefit that I have, the growth is slower than in the full ground. Absolutely true. But the roots are contained. I fertilize here, they grow there. It is at eye level, so it sits on my bench. I can see it every single day. I can prune and I can say, this branch is getting too heavy, I'm taking it off. If you put it in a full ground, the growth can be so explosive that if you don't pay attention for 3 or 4 weeks, it has fattened up so much that you get errors that you can't correct anymore. On top of that, here what you see is that the internode length, so the distance between individual buds, is quite short on many of the branches. This one has very long internodes, but this is nothing compared to what you might get in the full ground, where internodes of this distance are possible. What you need to know, an internode is a place where there's no buds. And for many species, like this Japanese maple, you will never get a bud on the area where there's not a bud yet now. So the only option to get a branch later on is by grafting. I prefer to not graft, so I prefer my growth to be slow, compact, and yeah, fattening up a little bit slower. In the end, that doesn't matter to me, because I enjoy the process rather than the end result. And in a pot it will never grow all that fast. It will not get a thick trunk and it will take forever to get anything decent. Well, actually, everything from here grew in the last 2 years in this pot. I repotted it last spring and then I decided I'm just going to let it grow for a bit. You can see the little markers here. This is going to be an air layer next year, and then a new tree to start off with from an air layer, which is 1 inch 2-3 centimeters thick already. And by next year it might actually be 4 or 5 centimeters, nearing the 2 inches. The aim here is, of course, I have got the big scar here. I want this wound to close fully. So that's why I let this shoot. But look at this branch. This is all from 1 year. And this is a Japanese maple of the variety Jelle. They get really nice crimson red leaves in spring. And they're typically known to be somewhat slow growing. Well, I think they're doing okay. So this is in a pot in 2 years' time. It was indeed overpotted for the size of the original tree, but now it is a nice big pot. The nabari is now starting to develop because that's the additional benefit of growing in a pot. Because this growing in a pot, I keep track of the roots much better. I can see when individual roots are starting to grow out of proportion, and like I've done here, I can remove that. Now if they're in full ground, that is less likely to happen properly. Here you can see also nice surface roots, because all the time this is covered, watered and fertilized around the base of the trunk. Every second year I take it out of the pot, prune back the bottom of the root ball, place it back into the pot, and you get a very nice flat nabari without a lot of work or very big roots that need to be removed or very big chop marks. So if not this size pot, what size pot should we use? Now this tree I planted in this container to grow out. And that was when this was maybe this size or half of the size. So this is a very big pot for this plant. Actually this is the limit that I would go. And how do you judge that? I guess you don't. But taking cutting of this side in a tub that size, this tree is never going to influence what's happening in this pot. So this is really too small for this pot. That being said, when is a pot too small to grow out? And that is a much more interesting question, because the pot size might not be as important as proper watering and fertilizing. And I'll show you why I think that. And I'm sorry, to make this point I really have to have a really ugly setup. I already showed you this one. This is growing in this tiny little pot. Everybody would say this pot is way too small. Well, it is quite small, but it is still growing well. It is still happy and healthy and developing. Except for this one leaf. But besides, you know, this is doing quite well and it could easily stay another year. I'm going to do some root work so it goes into a bigger pot. Now, this is what I really wanted to show you, because these trident branches, they're of course very gentle. This, however, is a sacrifice. And how old do you think it is? This is 2 years worth of growing in this, let's be honest, fairly small container. For, what is it? Can I get the top down into view? I don't think you can see it. But this really is a 4-meter sacrifice branch. Really aiding in fattening the base, closing some of the cut marks. And it all sits into a 7 centimeter, a 3-inch by maybe 1.5 foot, 45 centimeter wide container. This is a tiny container for the size of the plant. What you can see below it are sacrifice roots, and I'll talk about that in a second once I've changed the view. Now I don't know whether the term exists. I call them sacrifice roots, and this is what it is. Basically, a lot of the plants that I have that are not in a nice bonsai pot sit flat on the ground. The trident you just saw, they sit on a paved surface, so the roots really have nowhere to go. But this sits just on open soil. You see that the roots then escape from the pot and they start to grow. That means that even if the pot gets a little bit dry in the middle of summer, the soil is right underneath it and some of the roots are down there. I lift them every couple of weeks because I don't want very big heavy roots to go all the way down and then ruin my nabari. But this does aid the plant in a more stable growing environment than just in a pot. Yet it doesn't go as quickly as in the full ground. So this is a middle ground way to work with trees in a pot, growing them out, but still on the ground, and therefore giving them access to all these resources that are in the soil. Now, with that, I think I've covered most of the bases. I am not telling you grow out your seedlings in a pot, because it's going to be quick. Absolutely not. But take a couple of your seedlings and grow them out in a pot and see how refined the growth can get. How nice the bark can age, and how you get very tight internodes, aiding in developing a compact canopy. nice refined branching, small leaves and smaller scars. Because seriously, a scar like this will take quite a long time to heal and will always be very, very visible. And this is the result of this tree spending the first years of its life in the full ground, exploding with growth, never properly chopped. I chopped it when I put it in a pot, and everything else has grown in a pot. This was Jelle, growing bonsai, and don't listen to people who say you cannot grow a bonsai in a pot, because you might get the most refined bonsai ever by doing so.